with that, I'll hand it over to Jason to kind of kick us off with the NoSQL talk. You guys have your deck, so yeah.
And we practicing, sharing the same deck here. Fun times. How's everybody tonight?
Good.
No one's falling asleep thanks to the flu. That's nice. So when Matt approached me about coming to speak in Chicago, mentioning full stack NoSQL development, it was a very interesting topic. Obviously, very hot. There's a lot of people here tonight. So for those of you who don't know what it is, it involves a lot of the new way of doing databases with NoSQL databases, which replaces RDBMS. So, but before we get into that, I want to talk about something here. This is the Chicago .NET Developers Group, right? 3 years ago today, I met my loving girlfriend here. At this very group was our first ever date, as it were. She's been, a lot of you've met her. She's been here many, many times, and you know we've had some amazing memories together. And I want to ask her to come up here for a second. Let me show. You are the love of my life. You're my best friend, and these last 3 years have been an absolute joy with you in every moment we've shared together. Tonight, I want to stop being your boyfriend and ask you a question. 나랑 결혼해줄래? Stand up, please.
Oh my God! You lied to me. You said you were working. Oh my gosh.
Back to the section all here to see. Congratulations. And we're going to dinner. That's been in the course for 2 months. So I hope you, let's go say hi to Dino first. Thank you guys.
Congrats.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Lots of video of that too.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. It really is. You know, my wife has never been to a single one of my so that's really incredible. It's true. It's true. So I'm going to try to stall for time here. Let you guys calm down a little bit. Let myself calm down a little bit. Because I was in on this too. He came to me, well, I came to him and said, I want to speak to your user group. And he said, well, I've got this idea. Can you send me your slide deck? And I'll add some stuff to it. So I'm very excited to be here. This is an amazing surprise, and I'm glad I could be a part of it. But let me tell you about myself here. I'm Matt Groves. That's my Twitter account up there. I have a podcast and a blog. If any of you guys are interested in being on my podcast as a guest, I would love to have you on. crosscuttingconcerns.com. I have some really cool acronyms here. Oh, they're on their way out. So how about one more hand for the happy couple? I have some cool acronyms here. There's one more I didn't have time to add because as of Sunday, I am the Groves Family 2016 Cornhole Champion. So I think you guys should all know that as well about me. But more importantly, when it comes to sessions like this, can you guys hear me in the back okay? Do I need to speak louder or anything? You can hear okay? Great, great. I'm not an expert on NoSQL or anything like that. I'm just an enthusiast. I'm excited to learn about it and tell you guys about it. And if you guys can pick up one little thing or just try out a NoSQL database, that's the reason I'm sort of up here. So I do work for Couchbase. I'm a developer advocate for Couchbase. So let me just head off the inevitable question because it always comes up. Couchbase and CouchDB, they share an acronym of Couch. Otherwise, they're not the same thing. I mean, they're both NoSQL databases, but CouchDB is Apache Foundation, Couchbase is Couchbase Incorporated, and they're not a fork of each other or anything like that. They're two different NoSQL databases. So I just want to get that out of the way, since I know it was probably going to be asked anyway. And if you guys feel like tweeting, use the hashtag Couchbase. I would appreciate that so my boss doesn't think I'm here screwing around. I would say I got stickers for you in return, but I left them on my desk right before I left for the airport on Monday.
Oh, we're out of here then.
So sorry about that. What?
We're out of here then.
Oh. I was screwed up. But if you really, really want stickers, just let me know and I'll get them mailed to you. All right, so we're going to talk about full stack development with .NET and NoSQL. And if you're like me, right off the bat, you may have some problems with some of these buzzwords in the title. So let me just address those out of the way too. So when I say full stack, a lot of people are like, well, you don't really mean full stack. You're not writing the operating system. You're not writing device drivers and so on. And you're right. It's not the full stack. It's the application part of the stack. The software and maybe some infrastructure code. So that's what I mean by full stack. And the other term is NoSQL, which I have a problem with. And I work for a NoSQL company. And the problem is that it describes what it doesn't do, which isn't terribly useful. But it's a good shorthand for databases that are different than what we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years. So kind of a helpful little marketing shorthand. If I didn't use these shorthand terms, the title would talk to you something more like this. It isn't quite as zippy. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, and probably wouldn't fit in the text box for the submission form. So if you have those concerns about buzzwords, I'm with you too. But we're talking about full stack development, and what that means is basically you're somewhere around this middle part here. You're working on the UI, the front end. You're working with the database. You're developing some business logic in the back end, and you might be even deploying to infrastructure, coding out containers and continuous deployment, things like that. So anybody familiar with being in this spot in your organization, sort of being a jack of all trades, gripping all the different hats? Okay, good. So that's what we're really talking about. And when we say stacks, these are some of the acronyms you might see when it comes to describing a stack. So the LAMP stack, anybody familiar with that acronym? The mean stack is kind of the newer stack that we're talking about today. The actual individual elements aren't as important. Linux, it could be Windows, it could be a WAMP stack. But still, the concept is there. It's more server heavy. And then over here with the mean stack, it could be, in this case, Angular, but it could be, React or some other UI framework. The actual individual tools aren't important. So when we're talking about the stack, we mean the whole application layer there, and individual components that make it up. Now in the mean stack, though, the M up here typically stands for Mongo, but that's the NoSQL part of it. And so why is NoSQL sort of part of these newer stacks that we're seeing, like the mean stack? And one of the reasons is when you're developing these types of applications, you're often just developing endpoints for your UI to consume. Angular is going to make calls to the endpoints and then render the UI, handle all the UI interactions there in the browser. So what you often see is you start with relational tables, and you create an endpoint that renders something like this. And it's a JSON document, a REST endpoint that returns JSON. And so what people started to think was, well, why don't I store this instead of storing all these different tables? So then I can cut out all the joins and all the relational crap that goes along with that. So that's why NoSQL is very appealing to these types of apps. But I will say that Jason made the comment that it's the replacement for relational, and I don't know if that's really fair, because there are some places where relational is totally fine. It's a good fit for applications. You're comfortable with the tooling. You're comfortable with the way to use it. So if your application fits into that model, totally fine. I'm not suggesting you ditch it tomorrow or you never use it again. There are places where you can use relational still effectively. And sometimes you can use NoSQL alongside a relational as well. You know, it's what NoSQL is good at and then what relational is good at, working together in one app. Here are some guidelines, some rules of thumb for why you might use one or the other. I mean, these aren't hard and fast rules and no silver bullet either way, right? So it's just a different approach, different way of thinking. We're going to talk a lot about Couchbase tonight, and Couchbase is a distributed NoSQL database, which means that it's deployed to multiple machines. And the reason you do that is to improve performance, scalability, and availability, so that you don't have to take down the whole database, do some maintenance work, and then put it back up. You can take them down a piece by piece and do maintenance. Or if one node fails, well, the rest of the database will pick up the slack and keep working. A lot of people come to Couchbase because of the managed cache that's built right into Couchbase. So they'll use it as sort of a front end for their relational data, build it into a cache, and that way you can make requests to it very, very quickly from in-memory. So a lot of people start using Couchbase for that. And it can also act as a dumb key value store. You can store whatever value you want in the value. I'm going to talk about tonight its use as a document database, there's a lot of cool functionality there for document databases. And by document, I mean a JSON object stored as the value in a key value sort of situation. If we have time today, I'm also going to show you some of the mobile stuff that Couchbase has as an embedded database, as well as some synchronization stuff that I can show you as well. With Couchbase, we like to say that it provides two things, agility and scalability. And with agility is that slide I showed you earlier where you don't have to have all the schema stuff and all the joins and things like that. So it's easier sometimes to get started and to develop that. You don't have to worry about impedance mismatch and ORMs and things like that. There's some really cool querying stuff I'm going to show you a little bit of tonight. I'm also going to be showing it more in depth tomorrow, the Lake County user group, if any of you guys are up that way. And some big data stuff and mobile. With scaling, I said we have elastic scalability, so you can just rack up additional servers to improve your scalability or drop them down. So maybe after Black Friday is over or after the freshmen have all completed their forms, you can, okay, let's dial it back down the servers, we'll save some money since we don't need all that capacity right now. So it's on because of that distributed nature. So if a single node goes down, that means the rest of it will pick up the slack and it'll keep going. We have some cool stuff with multi-data center. If you have different geographical locations, you can sync the data between those pretty easily. Some really good administration stuff built right into Couchbase Server. I'm going to show you some of that tonight. And the kind of enterprise security you would expect. Now I'm going to talk mostly about .NET and C# today. But Couchbase can work with a lot of different languages and frameworks, as can many NoSQL databases. Java, Node, all works fine. I'm going to use Web API tonight, if anyone's familiar with that. You can use MVC, you can use Nancy, whatever else framework you want. I'm going to show it on Windows. You can, of course, use it on Linux and Mac OS X as well. And you can also deploy it to various containers like Docker and also to cloud services like Amazon and Azure, OpenStack, etc. Anybody here into big data type stuff, big data tools, analysis, reporting, things like that? Couchbase has a lot of integrations with some of the more popular ones like Hadoop, and Spark, and Kafka. There's all sort of native, well not native, but plugins that work directly with Couchbase for that integration. So I'm not going to talk about that much tonight here, but if you're interested in that kind of stuff, Couchbase can help you there. So the Couchbase server, the way it works is that you have a number of nodes. You need at least one, which is what I'm going to show you tonight. But for production, you probably need 3 or more nodes to really get the full benefit. But each node is equally important as any other node. So there's not like a master-slave or primary, secondary type of thing going on. They're all individually as important as each other. And they each provide storage, caching, and this cluster manager, which is what, as developers, we'll be interacting with mostly. You can also add on data service, query service, and indexing service to each node or to multiple nodes. So for instance, if you have a very query-heavy application, You could put the query service on nodes that have faster processors or more RAM. If you're just storing data and not really querying it very much, you can just rack up servers without that query service and so on. So there's a lot of options there for horizontal scaling as well as vertical scaling, what we call multidimensional scaling. Here's a screenshot of the Couchbase admin UI. This is built in when you install Couchbase Server. You access this via browser. We'll see some more of that today, but you get a nice dashboard here of all the status of the nodes and operations per second and how much RAM is being used up and so on. Additionally, we have some REST integration, so you can interact with the cluster and do lots of operations with REST if you want to automate various operations with administration. So that's sort of the basic intro there. Now, when you're accessing data from a NoSQL database like Couchbase, there's a few different ways you can get to that data. And one of the most common ways is to just access data by a key. And this means, so your data in Couchbase is stored as a key value, and the value is a JSON document. And you say, okay, I want the document that has key of K2. And Couchbase says, okay, here's your document. Here's document 2. And that is a very, very quick operation, because oftentimes you're going to be interacting with Couchbase's managed cache layer. So it's going to be a direct RAM access. You're not going to have to go to the disk to get a lot of these in many cases. And then the reads and writes are distributed evenly amongst those nodes I talked about. So if you have 4 or 5 nodes, when you write documents, it's going to be distributed evenly through an auto-sharding mechanism that's done with hashing. So you don't have to configure that. It's just going to spread out the data as you start writing to it. If you want to do something more complex, like some sort of query, one option you can do is a view using a static query. And these are often in the form of MapReduce. So anybody familiar with MapReduce pair of functions there? You basically write a mapping function that says, I want some properties of the document. So if I have 3 person documents, I can say, give me the name and the age of each of those persons. And then a reduce function which says, well, I only want to get the names that have an age greater than 21. So I'll reduce them to just the even list. And with Couchbase, you can write these and deploy them to Couchbase clusters, and you write them with JavaScript. So you write a map and reduce function together, and you can call them and run those queries. So these are what's used for the dashboard, by the way, that I showed you earlier. We have some MapReduce queries built in that Couchbase uses to get those statistics and metrics. And they're incrementally updated. So this can help you power analytics and reporting and things like that. These are really strong for complex custom aggregations. One other thing that you can do with Couchbase that I really like, one of the things I like most about Couchbase, in fact, is that even though it's a NoSQL database, you can execute a SQL query against it. Actually, it's called NQL and 1QL, which is a superset of SQL. So if you know SQL, then you already can use NQL with the Couchbase database. So in this case, I've said select star from bucket where age is greater than 21, which is kind of what I showed you in the MapReduce. Couchbase will figure that out and return Stephen a list. So you can use your SQL skills with a NoSQL database. So that's why I think the term is just kind of outliving its usefulness, because, yeah, it's NoSQL, but it has SQL. Whatever. There's also ODBC drivers available, so if you want to integrate with BI tools like Power BI or Excel, things like that, you can plug in ODBC drivers for that. All right, so let's get to some .NET now. Couchbase has an official supported .NET SDK. You find it on NuGet. It's called Couchbase Net Client. Currently, it's compatible only with the full .NET framework. We are very, very close to releasing a .NET Core version of the SDK. So that's on its way. It's not quite public yet, but it's almost there. It's open source, by the way. Everything's open source here, so you can watch the progress of the .NET Core as it's being developed, as I'm doing. All right, so if I wanted to start building an application, once I've included Couchbase Net Client from NuGet, once I've installed Couchbase Server somewhere, probably on your local machine, you you start by introducing some namespaces here. So I'm going to use the nickel, so that's why I'm including the Couchbase nickel namespace. You guys see this code okay back there? I know we got another TV back there too. It's probably helping. But here are some snippets showing how you can start, bootstrapping your application to talk to Couchbase. You start by defining a client configuration object and telling that object where all the nodes are. And so it's just one node in my example, so I'm saying, oh, it's a Couchbase //localhost. And if I had other nodes, I'd list them there. Optionally, I need at least one node. And then I'd say, okay, initialize my cluster helper using that configuration. So once I've initialized the cluster helper, I can then use that to talk to my Couchbase cluster. And that's going to use the cluster manager that I showed you in the previous diagram, sort of behind the scene. So once I have a cluster helper, I say, well, give me a bucket object. So I'll give you a bucket name, optionally a password, and now I have access to a bucket. Now a Couchbase bucket is what we call a collection of documents. And each document in that bucket has to have a unique key. So no two documents can have the same key. So it's kind of like a namespace in that way. Typically, you have one bucket per application. That's a rule of thumb. It's not required, but that's generally the guideline. So it's kind of like a database, but kind of not. And it's not like a table or anything like that. The next thing I want to show in this slide here is that I can just pass in a nickel string here to the query request and create that query object. And I'm not showing you this example, but I could also pass some parameters to that and some other options to execute a query and get results back. I'll show more of that later. Then the last step that I want to show you is how to create and save a document. So I'm just creating a new document object here of type dynamic. You don't have to use dynamic, but I did because I'm super lazy. I didn't want to create a type for just this sample. So it could be document of person or document of invoice. That's really up to you. And the ID is going to be the key of that document. There's no rules about what that can be. It could be a string, a GUID, a number, some more complex value. That's up to you guys to decide what you want your key to be. It does have to be unique within that bucket. And then the content is where I'm going to put the object that's going to get serialized into JSON and stored in my NoSQL database, Couchbase. And I just did an anonymous object here, but it could be just a POCO, whatever you want to put in there. That's up to you. It'll serialize it to JSON and store it in the database. By saying bucket.insert, saves it into Couchbase. Okay, so any questions on that so far? All right. At any time you guys have questions, feel free to stop me, wave your hand around, get my attention. You don't have to wait till the end if you think of something. Yeah, go ahead.
So prior to the slide, you were talking about how the different instances or different nodes are spread across. Do you have to have odd number of nodes then?
You have to have an odd number of nodes?
Yep.
Why would that be?
For consistency checking to see who wins out if two nodes get differing.
Okay. So your question is then if two nodes get split or one node goes down?
Split brain, right?
Right, so it's like a split brain network. So the way Couchbase works, I don't want to necessarily get into this too much today, but you must be familiar with the CAP theorem, I assume. You have to choose between consistency and availability. Couchbase has made the choice to choose consistency. So that means if a node goes down with a document on it, and you try to write a new value to that document, it will refuse that right. And say you can't save that because the node's down. So that way there are no conflicts with Couchbase. Now you can still possibly access a copy of that document as a replica. You can get a read-only view of that document. And if that node needs to fail over, which can be done automatically, by the way, then that replica will be promoted to an active document that you could then start reading and writing to. So it's made that decision to go the other way. There's no conflicts, things like that with Couchbase.
Do you mind if I ask one follow-up there?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm more of a SQL guy, right?
Sure.
But,
I think we all do.
Right, yeah, like the whole room, right?
Yeah.
But with Mongo, I know that there's in configuration you can choose how you want to close a transaction. You know, whether it's written to one node or written to more than one node or all nodes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have the same kind of configuration?
Yeah. So the question is basically if I want to save a document and guarantee that it's saved to multiple nodes, or replicated is what we call it. So you can absolutely do that with Couchbase. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that when you write to Couchbase, it writes to the memory. And when you do that, Couchbase says, okay, I'm done. Go on about your business. Now there's a chance that your node could go down before that document gets saved to disk, right? There's a small chance, right? Or, millisecond or whatever. So you can also say, I'm not going to consider this a success until you've saved it to disk, and then return me a success message. It's going to take a little longer, right? But you're guaranteed to write it to disk. Similarly, there's options to replicate it as well. You can say, I'm not going to consider this a success until you've replicated the document onto 1, 2, or 3 other nodes. So you can definitely configure that. It's just going to take longer for your transaction or for your document to be saved. Thank you. Yeah, very good question. Okay. All right, here's a little bit more. I'm going to show some async, await stuff tonight. Anybody comfortable with async and await in C# and .NET? Seeing no hands. So I'm not raising my hand either because I'm not comfortable. So if I get it wrong, please come and tell me afterwards. But I've done my best to figure out the async, await stuff. It's not required. You don't have to do async, await. There's both synchronous and asynchronous options with Couchbase. I'm going to go through this line by line here. So this is just a method that's going to run a query. It's going to return a task that has some result in it. And the parameter I'm expecting is a nickel query of some sort. Then I'm going to say query request.create and pass that string in. It'll return a query that I'm going to run. And then I'm going to use the query async method. Again, dynamic because I'm lazy. That could just as easily be a POCO object in there that's going to map the results to. So this will return a result object. I'm awaiting it through the asynchronous version. The results object has things like, was it successful? What was the error if it wasn't successful? It also has a rows, which it's not really rows, but it contains all the documents that it found in the query mapped to whatever type you specified. So in my case, dynamic is going to map them to a dynamic object. If we did person, it would map them to a person object. Just maps them up by name, right? And so that results rows is going to be a list of dynamic in this case, and that's what's going to be returned by this asynchronous method, a list of dynamic objects. Okay? We'll see a little more of that later as well. What I want to show you now is a demo. So this code is all available online, if I can get on the screen here. Oops. The wrong Windows keyboard. All right, can you see that okay back there? Code isn't terribly important right now. I just want to show you a quick demo. So I've got a Couchbase server running locally on my Windows machine here. And let's show those. So I'm going to run my app here. This is an Angular app. It's I was messing with this earlier, so I left some stuff in here. Sorry. It's an Angular app, Angular 1, AngularJS. Zoom in a little bit here. It's a very simple CRUD application. It's going to give me a list of persons. I can add a new person with the new item button. And once persons show up, I can start editing them and deleting them. So we'll say, I'm the last pass. Say the room at room.com. So that saves a new person object there, and I can say bride dot edu. Okay, so now I've got 2 person documents in there. I can edit them and delete them. So I made a mistake. This should be .com. Save that. And so I made the change there. I can go ahead and I don't want to delete either of them. I feel bad if I do that. So let's put myself in here. So I show up as Matthew Groves, and I can hit delete. There is no confirmation that says, are you sure you want to delete? Because, again, I'm super lazy. But we can now go over to the Couchbase console, which is by default port 8091. I'll just log into that console here. This is kind of like your SQL Server Management Studio. That's how I think of it in my mind. It's that sort of utility that I use to interact with the database. So I can see that I've got some RAM allocated for my data nodes, some disk allocated. I've got 2 buckets, some operations per second are happening. I've got 1 server. You click on server nodes here and see that I've got 1 node and it's up and it's got all 3 services running. And I've got 31,000 plus documents in it right now. Go over to data buckets. You see I've got 2 buckets. Travel sample we'll talk about later, but default's the one I'm using for my full stack application. There's 2 items in there, right? The bride and the groom. Click on documents. There they are, bride and the groom, and I'm choosing some GUID for the key to those documents. So there's the key in the left column. The content is a JSON object, and I can even drill down, edit those if I wanted to. You can see the full document here in JSON. There we go. We've also got this type field in here, which we'll talk about some later. There's nothing magical about any of these fields. It could be completely arbitrary JSON. I can have arrays in here, nested objects, nested objects, etc. As complex as JSON as I want to make. Okay, what else do I want to show here? I think that's it. So any questions on my extremely amazing CRUD app with using Angular and Web API and the whole thing? Okay, we're going to dig into some code of this application, but it is available on GitHub, so you don't have to, you can get it later and play with the whole thing. I'm not going to show you every little bit of code in the app, so you can get the whole thing later and check that out. Let's head back over to the slides. Where are they? Oh. Go back to the start floor. Okay. Where was I? Yeah. Demo web. All right, so when I say we, I mean Couchbase likes to talk about the Keen stack because we're putting ourselves in there instead of Mongo, making the Keen stack, or the Kane stack, maybe, I don't know. But there's not a really cool acronym for us Microsoft guys. We have Web API instead of Express, and we have ASP.NET or IIS instead of Node. So, I don't know, it's like Kawa or Waka. It's really a little work. But the individual pieces aren't terribly important in a full stack app, right? You have some sort of endpoint framework, you have a UI framework running in the browser, and you have the server that's running your website, your endpoints, your operating system on there too, and so on. Claw? No, it's not working. But this is sort of that modern stack design that Jason mentioned early on, and what the Keen stack basically is that we have everything in the front end there. We have templates, we have JavaScript, CSS, it's all over there. This side, we just have endpoints, so there's no Razor over here, there's no HTML, there's nothing like that being rendered. It's just endpoints returning JSON data running on a server back end. And so they're nicely separated. They're only joined together by those endpoints and by those URLs. And so what that means is you could, hypothetically, switch this out to some other framework or some other UI, and backend would remain intact, or vice versa. Or more to the point, you could reuse that backend across multiple applications. So I have a web app I'm showing you, but I could consume that endpoint from my phone or from some other device, like I guess an Xbox controller. I don't know. But let's say I purchased a product via the browser, it would show up as on my phone, because I'm using the same endpoint. I can see that order history on my phone there. So they're all front ends to a single back end. So let's talk about the back end here. So Web API. Anybody here familiar with Web API or used it before? A few people? Yeah, okay. I like Web API. MVC works fine too, or some other framework that you like, but I'm going to go with Web API. Let's start with the most exciting part, the web.config file. I've added a couple big settings here to point to the server. You don't really need that port number on there, but it's fine. So this is just localhost, what that basically is saying, and I've called it bucket RESTful sample, although mine's called default. So you can call it bucket whatever you want to call it. So those are just 2 settings in a web config file or not config file or whatever. Then application start. So this first part you guys should be familiar with if you've done a file new before. That's all generated for you by Visual Studio, doing routing and so on. This new part down here is kind of what we've seen before, setting up our cluster, helper is passing in app config setting now from that web config setting for the URI. I'm turning off SSL because I'm running this locally, so I don't have a certificate. Initializing cluster helper, so kind of what we've seen before. And then finally, I'll put a cluster helper close to make sure any resources when the application, restarts or whatever gets closed up. Yeah, go ahead.
You've got a cluster. Are you like pointing to a load balanced IP, so basically you can hit any node in the cluster, or is it like aware of like all the nodes in the cluster and the config? Or?
So the question is, what am I pointing to with this cluster IP here, right here? And with Couchbase, the answer is you can point to one or all of the nodes in the cluster. There is no load balancing node or load balancing node. They're all equal.
I understand they're all equal, but I mean, if you point to a specific node and that node goes down, you're screwed.
Yeah, well, okay, so if that node goes down, so once you connect, the cluster helper is going to go to that node. It's going to figure out what all the other nodes are.
No, but if that node is already down.
Yes. So, but it's a very good point. I'm coming to this, is that if your application restarts and that node goes down, then it's not going to be able to connect because you're only giving it one node. So it's a good practice to give it all the nodes that you know about here in the config. So that's why this is a list of URIs. So my example is just one locally running node. But in the real production app, you probably specify all the nodes that you know of here. It's a good idea to do that. Yep. Okay, well, let's get to a endpoint here. So I'm creating a RESTful controller. It's an web API controller. Itself is inheriting from API controller up there. And I'm going to say, all right, new up this record model class, which I haven't created yet, haven't shown you yet, so we'll get there. And just making that a property of the, not property, a field of this class. And that record model is going to be kind of like a repository to interact with Couchbase and save documents. Because we don't want to have, database-specific stuff in our controller, right? We want to keep that separated, so keep things testable. I probably should use an IOC controller here, dependency injection sort of thing, but try to keep things simple for demonstration. But you probably want to use that in the real app, otherwise you'll be copying and pasting this same thing over a whole bunch of controllers, and we don't want that. So here's an actual endpoint. This is one to save a person to the database. I'm using the route attribute to specify the URL for this endpoint. You don't have to do that, but I like using route endpoints. It makes it very explicit. I'm looking at this action method. I know exactly what URL I should be using. You can use the more traditional routing system too. That's fine. This is going to be a post endpoint. I'm going to post a new person object to this endpoint. And I've created a class here, so I stopped being lazy. I created a person class here. It's just a POCO that defines some fields that make up a person, so first name, last name, and so on. It's asynchronous endpoint, so it returns a task that returns an action result. Again, async not required. I just thought, the Node guy is always bragging about how they're asynchronous, so I figured we would show them that we can do the same thing. In this endpoint, I've put in some very rudimentary validation. You don't have to do it this way. You can also separate that out to another class or whatever you want to do. But this is a demonstration. I'm saying, well, you need to have a first name, a last name, and an email. Otherwise, I'm rejecting that as a bad request. That's a 400 response. And then, assuming it passes all that, we'll call the record model save method, pass in the person object to it, and then I'll wrap that in an OK. That'll return at 200, assuming it goes successfully there. Everybody okay with that so far? Nothing too crazy there? Okay. Here's another one. This is just to get a document by the document ID. So I'm using GUID in this case. You don't have to use that. Use whatever else you want to. And this is a API get is the route I'm going to use. It's a very basic validation again, just checking to see that you've actually sent a document ID. And then if you did, well, I'll return the result of the get by document ID method in the record model. Here's a delete endpoint. Hopefully you're starting to see a pattern here. Again, it's a post. You can use a delete verb if you wanted to use that instead, if you're down with all the different HTTP verbs. I'm just passing the person in this case, making sure the document was specified. And then if so, call the delete method of record model. So it's a good practice to keep your endpoints very, very thin. Make them not do a lot of business logic within the endpoints themselves. Delegate that to a repository or a service or some other sort of code. This is just a traffic cop, basically, what these endpoints are. Like I said, getting the data in, directing it off to a service, and then returning the results. That's all they should be doing. Keep them very, very thin. So let's look at the record model class now. Here's the save method on that class. It's taking in the person object, and I'm showing something similar to what we already showed you earlier with creating a new document. Using dynamic here, although I could just as easily use person, but I'll tell you why in a second that I didn't go that route. So this line here contains some of the newer C# syntax. So if you're not up to snuff on that, that's totally fine. I'm just going to walk you through it here real quick. We'll look at the data object first. So that's a person that's being posted here. I'm going to see if there's a document ID. If there's a document ID field, I'm going to check to see, is that document ID null? This is the new question mark dot operator. So if that's null, then it's going to return null, or it's going to return null for this half of the statement here. If it's not null, get the string value of it. All right? And then this half here is going to be use the null coalesce operator. All that does is say, is this null on this side? If so, use this side instead. Otherwise, use this side. And so if it's null, it's going to generate a new GUID and write that to string. So what this means is that if I'm creating a new person or updating an existing person, this code will work for both of them. It's either going to use the existing ID or it's going to generate a new ID. So is everyone following that syntax okay? If it's not, it's totally fine. I can go through it again. I know this is newer syntax. Sometimes haven't quite, it's hard to keep up sometimes with the new stuff they're introducing in C#. I haven't even gotten to the new C#7 stuff yet. I haven't got a chance to look at that stuff yet. So. Yeah, back there.
Yeah, I get the double question mark.
Yeah.
Pick one or the other,
Yeah.
depending on whether the former is null or not. What's that question mark right after the single question mark right after the end?
Yeah. So the question is, what's this question mark dot operator here? So normally you could say in old C# before that you'd say data dot document ID dot toString, right?
Yeah.
And that will return you the string version of the document ID. But what if this is null? It's going to be a null reference exception. So this just kind of avoids that. It says, well, if this is null, then just make the whole thing is null. Otherwise, get the string values. So I don't know. Is there a name for that operator? Null. Was it? Null. No, not null coalesce. Sorry?
He said nullable type, so yeah.
Well, the document ID is a nullable type, but I don't know what this operator is called. I can't remember.
It got introduced to Java a while ago, I think.
Oh, yeah?
It was in Groovy.
It was in Groovy?
Groovy, yeah.
Okay. I can believe that. The Java language itself, I don't know if I believe that. Yeah, I probably should write an alternate version of this that's more wordy, but maybe it would be easier to understand if you're not used to those operators. The next thing I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, content, saying the document value.
It's called a conditional operator.
No, like conditional operator. That's what it's calling the question mark dot. Okay. So with content here, what I could do is I could just say content equals data, and it would be done. And save that document, save the data, with serialize it to JSON, that would be fine. But what I'm doing here is I'm mapping individual values to an anonymous object. And it's kind of because I want to demonstrate what's going on here, but also it's kind of safer this way because if someone changes that person class, well then I could end up serializing stuff that I don't want to serialize into the database. Additionally, I also want to add in this, I want to sort of hard code this type equals user field in there. Because what I'm saving here is a document of, it's a user document, right? But our buckets can contain documents of all kinds. So I want to be able to delineate between user documents and other types of documents. This is one way to do that. There's nothing magical about the type itself. You could call it food, you could call it whatever. It's just what I've chosen to use to delineate those documents. And then once I have that document, I'm just calling this the bucket again. I'm saying upsert asynchronous. So it's an asynchronous call. You don't have to use asynchronous, but I am. Upsert is a combination of update and insert. So what's going to do is if that document already exists by key, it's going to update it, update the value. If it doesn't exist, it's going to insert a new document, hence the insert. That's a pretty common thing in NoSQL databases, and Couchbase has it too. So, a lot to take in there. Any questions so far?
So here we are seeing like what are the documents that we are writing as well as in the JSON format. It's also possible to save some proper document like maybe some Excel or Word in the XML format.
XML format?
Yeah.
So with so the question is, can I save this as XML format?
Not exactly. This has a XML format, but if I want to save some XML into this cache.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you want to store something beside, maybe you want to store something besides JSON, XML or YAML or something else, right? What I'm showing you right now, you can't do that with these operations, but Couchbase can also act as a key value store, which I showed you on a slide earlier, I think. In that case, it doesn't care what the value is. It could be XML, it could be binary, it could be text, whatever you want to store in there. That's a different approach to NoSQL. Couchbase can do both of those things. The difference is that if we're using JSON documents and we're storing JSON in Couchbase, we can actually run queries on that and say, well, I want to get all the documents where type equals user, which that would be much more difficult to do if you're just storing values of any sort of arbitrary format. There are some use cases for that. So it is supported, but that's not what I'm showing you in this example tonight. Yeah, all the way back there.
Yeah, this may be a more of a stretch question, but is there a possibility in the future where link will be supported?
So the question was, is link supported?
Well, in the future, yeah, you've heard.
Why don't you wait a few slides?
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, we'll see some link today. Yes, definitely. All right, so once I've run this upsert operation, I'd see something like this, which I kind of showed you already before. This is the key. It's just some arbitrary GUID. And this is the JSON object, which is, again, very simple, but could be more complex if you wanted to. Here is a way to get a document out of the database. So I've chosen to demonstrate nickel for this case, the get document by ID method. There's actually an operation built into the bucket to get documents by their key. And that's a much faster operation than using nickel. But I thought I'd show off some nickel in this example just to get you a little bit comfortable with it before I show you some more complex stuff. So this method is taking in the document ID, the key of the document, and I'm generating a SQL query here that says, okay, give me these fields, first name, last name, email, from all the documents, from the bucket name, which you don't see here, but it's actually a property of the class or a field of the class, aliasing that bucket as users, and then I'm saying, give me some metadata about the documents. One of those things is the key, where the key equals $1. That's a parameter. That's your passing. You have a question?
Is it similar to Mongo in that you can't do joins?
So the question was, is it similar to Mongo in that you can't do joins? And the answer is, you can do joins. This is nickel. It's a superset of SQL. So it includes all the goodness you come to expect from SQL, joins, unions, subqueries. Now the joins are, you can't join one field to another. You can join one field to another key right now. Maybe a field-to-field join is coming later down the line, but right now it's field to key. So you can do joins, yes. Yeah, back there.
That ID, basically, is that the only type, like, can you custom define what metadata you store?
Can you custom define what metadata is stored? And I don't think so. The metadata is like couch-based metadata.
Okay.
So if you want to store some other data, you can store it in the document yourself. You can define the document however you want to. But you can't actually add fields to metadata. There's some other stuff in there like, I don't know, time to live and CAS and things like that. But, sorry?
What about an E-tag? Is that part of metadata?
A what tag?
E-tag?
E-tag. Not familiar with E-tag. It
In
might be.
NoSQL databases, it's a common like ID to basically allow for optimistic concurrency.
So it might be called that. It might be called CAS in our system. So yeah, I don't think it's called. I don't think we have something called E-tag, but it might be the same thing, just with a different name. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I take this query and then I put into query request.create. It's just a string in here. Now I have to add a parameter here because you can have SQL injection in a NoSQL database. So make sure to parameterize your arguments. So that's what I'm doing here. That's in document ID. Then saying query asynchronously and save those to dynamic objects and return the rows from the result there. So this is going to, it's only going to ever select one document here because I'm doing it by ID. But it's going to be a collection of documents of size 1. And again, don't actually do this because there is an operation called bucket.get that does this much faster. Just kind of getting the toe into the pool of nickel right now.
If you're returning the rows, shouldn't the task be like list dynamic or something like
You
that?
could make a list dynamic, but dynamic can also be a list itself. So, yeah. And because these are going right to an endpoint, I don't need to do any extra processing on them, so I'm just sort of dumping it out there. Okay. Here's some more new C# syntax, which you may not be familiar with, but here's a delete method. So this is going to have a document ID. I'm going to say bucket.remove or remove async. And pass in the document, it will remove the document. So if you're not familiar with this, again, I'm not sure what the operators call it, but it's really a shortcut for that.
Lambda?
I don't think it's a lambda. It's, I can't remember it. But it's basically, you remove the brackets and you get rid of the return, and then there you go. So it's the same thing as this. Okay, so I'm going to, oh yeah, go ahead.
What type of security is supposed?
Say that again?
Security?
What kind of security?
Yep.
So there are lots of security options with Couchbase. You can definitely put a password on buckets. You probably should in production. There's some, it's X459 or what? Well, I don't know what that.
509.
What's it?
509 certificates in there?
Yeah. 509 certificates. That's supported too. I'm not a security expert by far, but there's plenty of security options there. Enterprise level security there. We have some encryption as well. I think that's by it might be by a third party at this point to encrypt your data in Couchbase, if you need to do that.
So do you have user level access?
Do you have user level access?
Yeah.
So yeah, with Couchbase 4.5, I believe you have roles available. So you can create, I think it's users and roles that can access, they can have write access or things like that.
And what about the backup?
And what about backup? Yeah, there's backup. CB backup is our command line tool to back up databases and restore database. CB restores databases.
Is it a single file or it's something?
Say that again?
Is it a single file? The database?
Is it a single file? I don't know. That's a good question. The question was, is it a single file that gets backed up to? And probably it is. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly though.
Of course, that's not transaction safe, the backups, right?
The backups are not transaction safe. I don't know about that. If what you're saying is, if a backup fails, it probably still reads part of the database?
Well, if writes are still occurring to the database while you're doing your backup,
Yeah.
because it's not a highly transactional.
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. So yeah, probably it's going to only back it up at a certain point.
Right.
When you start the backup.
Right. Whereas like SQL Server, you'd have your log file continuing to grow while the backup was going.
I'm going to look into the multiple files thing. I've never used the backup and restore utility. I'm kind of new to Couchbase, so I'm going to look into that and find out for you. That'll be a new blog post idea. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to move over to Angular now, unless you guys have more questions. What's that?
I'd like to know.
Oh, it is Lambda? Okay, I thought it was called something else. I know there is a Lambda operator.
Myself, so I had to check.
Okay. I know there's a Lambda operator, but I don't think, yeah.
I mean, that is a lambda, but there's probably something additional for saying you can assign a lambda to a function.
Yeah, something like this.
She's a delegate.
Yeah, it's kind of like a delegate. It's basically syntactical sugar is what it is. I mean, it's just swapping that for that.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
I might have missed it if you covered it. When you did I think it was the insert or update or upsert.
Yeah.
You did it as a dynamic instead of using the object that it was coming in as.
Yes.
Was that just?
It's right here?
Yeah, was that just like a separation of models, or?
Yeah. Basically, I was saying I could pass data right into this. That's totally fine.
Okay.
But my thought was, if someone changes that person class, then I might be serializing stuff, saving into the data that I don't want saved into the data. So I'm choosing to map it one by one.
Okay, and then you mentioned you were talking more about types, and you're going to come back to it, but
Yeah.
let's say somebody does change that person class, and then you have, like, do you end up with mixed types? Do you do a migration? And then how do you handle the deserialization? And I would imagine you're talking about, because you have that type reference,
Mhm.
you could essentially have, you know, a reference that's stored with each document to tell you how it can be deserialized.
Well, so the question is, if I change that person type and then I deserialize it later, how is that going to work? So
Right.
If I were to pass in, so if I'm pulling it back out, if I were to put person here
Yep.
as the type, it's going to try to map all those fields that it can to what the person type currently is.
Right.
So if there are fields that are not there, they won't get set, and
Right.
vice versa.
Right.
So it's going to, this is going to go off of whatever type you put in there as you're running it.
Right.
So-
So you either have to do it to dynamic and then deserialize it yourself, or you have to really know what you're getting before you request it, as far as the type that you're getting.
So if you're adding more fields to your person object,
Yeah, I mean, let's say you're adding one that's now not nullable, or I don't know, like, you know, obviously if we're up to developers, we would only change certain things, but
Yeah,
when it's
right.
up to the business, it doesn't always work that way.
right? So like not nullable, like an integer or something, it's just not going to get set. It's going to remain its default value,
Okay.
which is 0 for an integer, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Okay.
That's cool though. I think that's a good feature because, like with any framework, if you had maybe a computed property or something like that,
Yeah.
it would blow up, right? It would try to say, oh, I don't have a good map for this, and it would just explode. So you're saying that this will not. It'll basically, it's more tolerant to skipping properties it can't directly map to.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's true on every framework, but yeah, I think you're right in that it's a lot more flexible here. Your schema is not as rigid. In any framework, you have to deal with that potential mismatch between your table and your object. Where in this case, you're basically just storing objects, and as they evolve, the old objects will still hypothetically map to the new ones. Right? So there's some more flexibility there, but there's some more rigor you have to now put into your data design and your code, for sure. So you can store anything you want to, but it doesn't mean you just go off half-cocked and store anything, right? You should have some rigor and some thought about what you're storing and how you're storing it, for sure. So the database isn't forcing the schema on you. You should force the schema on it.
But by using the dynamic, you're not really forcing it either. So you're kind of just like throwing it to the side.
Yeah,
and saying, well,
I'm using dynamic here because I'm super lazy. It makes for an easier demo for slides, but I probably would never want to use dynamic in a real application.
Okay, well, this is why I was curious how you felt about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Angular. So I know there are some of you in the group who are comfortable with Angular JS, and I'm not one of them. I'm not an Angular expert at all. So I'm just going to kind of scratch the surface here of Angular. And if you're not interested in Angular, that's fine. A React or Backbone or whatever else can work just fine, do the same sort of thing. So I'm just going to show you a couple quick examples of the source code. You can see the full thing on GitHub. So here is in the Angular app.js file. I'm creating a function here called fetch all. I'm putting it on the scope, on the Angular scope there. And that function is just going to make an HTTP GET request to this API endpoint get all. I didn't show you that one, but you can imagine what we'll do with get all the person documents. Then here's a promise here, JavaScript promise that says if that's successful, then that's the result of the function I defined here. And that's just going to loop through and set this items property on scope to the key value pairs. There's the key, there's the value of the document. So then I can take that and apply it to my Angular templates and show, the list of persons to a grid or a table there in my HTML page. So all this is really doing, all this is connected to the back end is through this API endpoint. It doesn't matter if it's web API or if it's Express on Node or whatever, it's going to just communicate via that. And if I want to save a document, here is the save method. In this case, I just have a function that I'm passing all the values into that Angular method. Again, probably not optimal. There's probably better ways to do that. So this is going to make another HTTP request to the post endpoint here for API save, which I did show you earlier. I'm going to pass in this to the, this data is going to be posted there as the body of that request. I'm also going to pass in this document ID, which if we're creating a new person, this document ID will probably be undefined or null. And so that will pass a null or undefined to the document ID, which is fine, because our endpoint can handle that. It can handle it not being there, and it'll just create a new document. If it does exist, it'll pass document ID, and it'll update the existing document. So this save method works for both inserts and updates. Yeah, and state params is the way to get the Angular parameters. So that's the extent of the Angular code I can show you in slides today, but the full example is available out there on GitHub if you guys are interested. Okay, any questions on that? Anybody here using Angular? This is Angular 1, Angular JS. A bunch. Okay, anybody using Angular 2 yet? One? Anybody want to use Angular 2 yet? Oh, okay, interesting. All right. What about anybody else using anything else like Backbone or Ember or React, anything like that? There's a new one every day, so. Okay, cool. All right. I want to go back to C# here and show you some more complex NQL queries in C#, just to show you that this is a serious implementation of SQL. It's not just a sort of SQL looking. It's an actual SQL implementation. So I'm going to switch over to a new bucket called the travel sample. This is building the Couchbase server. When you install it, you can optionally install the travel sample. It's kind of analogous to Northwind. If you're familiar with SQL, which is sort of a sample data set you can play with lots of sort of real looking data in there. And in this case, I'm doing a union. So I have two selects. I'm going to union them together. And what I'm getting here is all the routes that go from an airport or to an airport. So I'm selecting the airport code, the geolocation, which is a embedded object with latitude, longitude, and elevation. From the buckets, aliasing that as R. I'm not sure why I'm aliasing it as R. And then where airport name equals, the from or the to that I passed in. Those are the positional parameters there. It's again asynchronous, so it's going to wait on that query. And if I did that, result would look like this. This is a screenshot of the query workbench in the Couchbase console admin. So here's the result. You can see there's Columbus, and here's the geolocation. It's a complex object. It's not just 3 fields, but it's a one field with 3 fields in it as a sub-object. And down here is the Dayton Wright Brothers airport. So I meant to update it to be O'Hare, but oh well. And then here, if you click on the table tab, you can see sort of a table view of that JSON data. So maybe it's a little easier to picture what's going on here. Well, we've got 2 fields, and one of those fields is just a string, and one of those fields is actually an object that itself has 3 fields. So it's sort of like an embedded table, kind of. All right. Now here's a more complicated example, and I'm going to go through this a little slower, so don't panic if it looks really complicated here. But this shows you sort of the additional stuff we put into NQL. Because we're dealing with JSON and not tabular rows, we need some additional functionality. That's what makes it a superset. So in this case, I've created a method called find all routes on day. So I want to find all the routes from airports A to airport B on a specific day of the week, like Sunday. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm familiar with the unnest. What does that do?
Yes, that unnest is a syntax we've added to SQL to help deal with JSON. I'm definitely going to cover that for sure. So what I'm doing is, you can see here I'm selecting some fields here from, you can see the aliases are R, A, S. Those are all covered there. So the first one is travel sample bucket. I'm aliasing it as R. So I'm selecting routes. I'm going to unnest a field from those documents, which is the schedule. And the schedule is an array of all the flights that happen in that route. So if you have a route of San Francisco to Miami, there could be 10 flights that take that route. I'm going to do a join to this sample bucket, and my route has a field called airline ID, which is a key to another document. So I'm going to join documents together based on that key. I'm going to apply some standard wheres and order it by name. So don't panic if that looks too complicated. I'm going to go through it here slowly and interactively in the query workbench. So the unnest, it takes this, it looks at the schedule field, which is an array, and it puts it into this S. So it kind of treats it as, it's kind of a join, but to itself, to its own document. So from S, I can get the flight and the time. And don't worry, well, hopefully this will be clear when I explain it sort of interactively here. So let's go over here to the Query tab. And this is kind of a way for you to design nickel queries and execute them and see what happens. So I've got some examples here. So we'll walk you through it. So let's start with something relatively simple looking. You guys see that okay? So this is a much more simple select. It's saying give me those fields from every document in the travel sample bucket, which I'm aliasing as R. And I only want documents where the source airport equals San Francisco and the destination airport equals Miami. So go ahead and execute that, and this is the results. So I should have, let's see, I have 3 results here. Oh, screwed up. There we go. So the first result is this airline, 439. I don't know what airline that is, but that's kind of like a foreign key. It's a key to another document somewhere in my bucket. Here's some information about the airport or the route. And then here's the schedule field. The schedule field is an array of schedule objects. So if I look at the JSON view, you can see that here's my basic fields, and here's the schedule field, which is an array. Day, flight, time, over and over. So I have 3 sets of that. So there's another one with a different airline, and another with a different airline. So I've got all that data there. So that tells me all the routes from San Francisco to Miami. All right? So that might be useful. That's a good set of data. Maybe I can work with that. But let's say I want to flatten out a little bit. Oh no, hang on. Let's do this first. So instead of saying airline 439, I actually want to get the name of the airline. That's stored in a separate document. So I need to join to that document to get it. So let's add a join in here. So I'm joining this R alias to another alias. It's in the same bucket, but I'm calling it A for airline. And I'm joining it on the keys that are in R airline ID. So this key right here will join to another document and combine it into the result. So execute that. And now instead of the airline ID, I have American Airlines. So I'm selecting A.name from that. Notice now I only have a result of 2. I think there might be a missing airline in this sample. Maybe that's on purpose, I don't know. But there's only 2 because this is just a join. If I wanted to do them all, I'd do a left join. Now I have a result count of 3, but notice there's no name here because it's null because that airport doesn't exist. All right, so left joins, they're all in there. So 2 results. Okay, with me so far? Joins and NoSQL, SQL and NoSQL. Pretty wild stuff. Okay, now let's look at unnest. So I have this schedule field here. It's an array, sort of a subtable, right? Now suppose I want to flatten this out and join my parent document to each row of that subtable or that subdocument. So I'm going to say unnest r.schedule and alias that is s. This is kind of like a join, but it's there because JSON has arrays, so we need some additional syntax to deal with that. Execute that. Now instead of 2 results, I have 52 results because I've done a join amongst those subarrays. So most of the data in these rows is identical except for the flight is different because that's different per flight, and the time is different. It's different per flight. So there's some for American Airlines, and there's some for U.S. Airways. Right, so it's kind of another type of join, but it's really unique to the JSON data type. This really wouldn't make sense in a relational model, a pure relational model. Yeah, good.
Does database maintain a data type?
Does the database maintain a data type?
Yeah.
So what do you mean by a data type?
Like in condition, how it differentiates whether it's a string comparison or
I'm sorry,
integer
I'm trouble hearing you.
So in where condition,
Yeah.
how it's understand whether it's a string comparison or it's an integer comparison?
Oh, I see. Oh, yes. So the fields in JSON, they have a type, just like JSON has a type. So your field may be a string, a number. What else is in JSON? String, number, Boolean. Well, array, another object, of course, and there's one more.
Date count?
Well, there is no official date in JSON, but there is some date methods in NiCL to deal with that. So yeah, there are types, just like JSON has types. This is just using JSONs.
So how to specify the type?
How do you specify the type? Well, just like you do in JSON, you use it's literally a string with quotes, or it's an integer, just with numbers. I mean, it's just how you'd expect it. So if I looked at, well, I don't know. If you look here at the JSON, you can see that this is a string because it's in quotes. This is an integer because it's just got a literal integer there. And if I went, well, you saw the example earlier with arrays, same sort of thing there. So if you like JSON, this is just regular JSON. If you don't like JSON, well, sorry, it's JSON. Okay, and let's finish up the example here. I'm going to say, I just want all the flights on day 0, which I guess in the travel world is Sunday. Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question. This reminds me of, beyond this reminds me of something that Access came up with later on where they would have a drop-down object that was impossible to work with, I thought. But
I'm sorry, I blacked out if you said Access.
Yeah, I know. But would you use that on Nest to populate a drop-down box and then do the two-table kind of, I forget what you call it, where you look up an item in it and it pulls up the whole table.
Crosstab, is that the view? Like something like a crosstab, is that what that would have been called?
I don't think it's quite the same thing. I don't know if I'd use that for a drop-down. The on Nest anyway. I mean, I guess you could. I don't see why
It's essentially turning columns into rows is what it's doing, right?
Yeah, in a way. Yeah, basically. Sorry?
I was going to say pivot.
Pivot?
It's not quite the same.
No, it's not really the same thing as pivot, but I mean, we're in the neighborhood, right?
Still kind of scares me in that way.
Oh, okay. Well,
I think it's pretty neat in the fact that because you're nesting arrays and everything on this. Can I ask though, your execution time obviously dramatically increased, right? Like tenfold or so. Can you talk a little bit about indexes?
Yeah. So you're talking about the execution time here. Indexing is definitely a feature that is very important in Couchbase, even more so than relational, because you have buckets that have a whole bunch of documents in them. You know, you're indexing the bucket, not just individual tables, right? Don't go off the execution time on my machine. This is running on my developer machine. I've got limited resources designated to it. So don't go off that time as a benchmark. But yeah, indexing is important. The travel sample, in fact, comes with some indexes built in. These are going to make a huge difference in your query time. So I've got some indexes here. So for instance, type. If I said where type equals foo, it's going to use that index, right? If that index wasn't there, it's either not going to run because there's no index it can use, or I'm going to have a more generic index like this one up here, primary. If I hit a primary type index, it's basically a table scan, so it's going to be pretty slow. So I have to go through each of those and figure out how to run that query. So indexing is very important thing to do. I don't have time to go into it today, unfortunately, but very rich indexing library. There's like 7 different types of indexes in Couchbase. If you go to the Couchbase forums, people are asking about indexing all the time. One thing that might help, if you use the keyword explain here, execute that, it'll give you some information about what indexes it's using, which ones it found, and things like that, which is great for debugging your indexing and figuring out, oh, did I do this indexing right or not? Yeah, go ahead.
Are the indexes set up the same way they are in SQL?
The index is set the same way in SQL. Kind of. So, I mean, for instance, I could just say create index, create primary index? Yeah. Primary index on my bucket name, for instance. And then I could go on, I don't know the exact syntax, but I could say field 1, field 2. Because this is JSON, I need some additional dotted syntax, so I could say like field 3 dot child dot grandchild, etc. Or if it's an array, I could say grandchild 0. So all that dotted notation, all the array notation is part of NCL now, because you need that to access those extra fields. So indexing is very important. Definitely get into that as you're getting into NCL. Okay. All right. I cleared all my history. But, oh yeah, I was doing this. So I added and day equals 0. So apparently in the travel industry, Sunday equals day 0. So execute that. And now I have 9 results. And these are all the flights on Sunday from San Francisco to Miami. So that would be a pretty helpful thing to have in my travel application. So if anybody here familiar with Cassandra, they have a thing called CQL, which is Cassandra Query Language. It looks a lot like SQL, but it doesn't nearly have as many features as this. There's no joins, there's no nesting, things like that. So this is a real full implementation of SQL, and it's improving with every release. Okay, let's go back over to the slides, I think. Why is it keep doing this? Just if you want to see those pictures again, that's why. I'm on to you, PowerPoint. Oh boy. Angular, complex, yep, we did that, on Nest. Okay, here is where you can find the full source code for the Angular app that I showed you today. Couchbase Labs on GitHub. There's lots of other cool stuff out there if you're interested in languages besides .NET or besides Angular. Go and check that out. A whole bunch of stuff there. Couchbase is all open source too. They're all on GitHub under github.com/couchbase. So you can check all that stuff out there too. And if you're interested in NCL, learning more about that, we have an online, interactive NCL tutorial that you can follow along the instructions or write your own NCL queries. And it's kind of like a sandbox environment, so you can enter whatever NCL you want to. You don't have to install Couchbase or anything. I think there may be a couple things disabled for security reasons, but otherwise it's the full NCL experience right there in your browser. So that's pretty cool. I really liked that when I started at Couchbase. Okay, now, so the part that someone in the back was waiting for, Link. Now, there's this open source tool called Link to Couchbase. It's not officially supported by Couchbase yet, but it is worked on by Couchbase employees, and it may become official at some point. Now, we don't have ORMs in Couchbase because we don't have, there's no impedance mismatch. What we do have is called ODMs, object data mappers. So you don't have to use Link to Couchbase, but if you don't want to write your own NCL or you want to do some other cool stuff with just writing C# code, you can use Link to Couchbase. So to start with Link to Couchbase, you might want to create a POCO class like airline here. And then you can put some attributes on it. I've put a document type filter with a airline string on there. Optional. You'll see why in a minute, that's optional. And then, unfortunately, the travel sample was created by those Java script guys, so they case their stuff differently than C# guys. So I'm saying, okay, name means name, right? Type means type. And then I'm ignoring this ID because that's what I want the key to go. That's not, I want to store that in the document itself. It's just going to be the key. All right? So then once I have this in place, this airline class, I can then write something like this with Link to Couchbase. I can say, well, DB would be bucket, actually. I should change that to bucket. I'll do it right now. I keep saying that every time I present this. I never change it. So bear with me here. I'm doing some quick editing. Bucket. There we go. you want to go back to page 1? No. All right. Okay, so now I can say bucket.query. You give me all the airline documents in my bucket, and then I want to select the names from them. So this would give me American Airlines, US Air, United, and so on. Okay. Now, I said earlier that this document type filter is optional. If I didn't put that on there, I'd have to add this line in and say, give me the documents where the type equals airline. Otherwise, it'll try to map every single document in the bucket to an airline object, which is not what you want, I don't think, because you don't want a route mapped to an airline. It doesn't make any sense. So if you put that attribute up there, it'll automatically sort of add that type equals to the where clause when it generates your nickel query. I'm showing you the link syntax. I don't really like the link syntax. You can use the normal extension method syntax too. That's up to you. This is a very good link implementation. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's again not officially supported, but it's a great open source project. Check it out. It's on GitHub as well. Okay, so that is all the Couchbase server content I have for now. If you guys have more questions, you can ask them now, or you can ask them if you think of it later. You can ask that as well. How are we doing on time? Because I've got some mobile content I can show you if you're interested as well. We're good on time? Okay. Maybe 15 minutes of mobile content. If you guys are interested in mobile, anybody into Xamarin in here, anything like that? Someone over here maybe, in this area? Okay, so now for something completely different. We're talking about Couchbase Mobile. Couchbase Mobile is sort of the umbrella term to cover all these parts. We have Couchbase Lite, which can live on your mobile device, your phone, your tablet, your IoT device, whatever. It's an embedded NoSQL database. You can kind of think of it as a replacement for SQLite, a mobile device. So that can be used just on its own, by itself as an offline, access locally database. Optionally, you can hook that up to Sync Gateway. What Sync Gateway will do is it will talk, the database will talk to Sync Gateway and sync data between that device and all the other devices that are hooked up to that Sync Gateway. So if I have, and I'll show you a demo of this, but if I have two apps, a to-do list app, and I put things on the list here, they'll get synced and show up on my other device over here. Just automatically in the background. You don't have to do any extra, well, some extra, but not much extra work to sync up those databases between each other. And then finally, you can hook up Sync Gateway to Couchbase Server to persist that data. Otherwise, Sync Gateway is just going to store it in RAM, and it's going to, if it goes down, you're going to lose that data. So you want to back it up to Couchbase Server cluster. All right. All three of these parts are open source, just like Couchbase Server is, and all available on GitHub. Couchbase Lite, as I said, it's kind of a replacement for NoSQL. It's stored on the device, so it's always available. It doesn't require you to be online to use it. And it can be used on the desktop if you want to. If you're writing a Windows format or a Mac OS X app, you can use it on those, but typically we see it on Android and iOS type of apps. Unity, Xamarin, PhoneGap. I'm not sure how many of those are officially supported. I know at least Android and iOS are. I don't know about Xamarin or Unity or PhoneGap, but there are SDKs available for those.
Xamarin is supported.
Sorry?
Xamarin is supported.
Officially supported?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm not the mobile advocate, by the way. I'm more of the server advocate. So if you have a really tough mobile question, I might point you to the guy who is the mobile advocate. So the other thing that this does is kind of interesting. I want to point out is it fires up its own sort of mini web server. That's when you're using Couchbase Lite, there's a mini web server there. So hypothetically, you could have devices communicate to each other and do some sort of peer-to-peer network. I don't think anyone's done that yet. I don't know if that's officially supported, but it's kind of interesting little tidbit there. Sync Gateway synchronizes data to and from, or to or from, Couchbase Lite, and you can sync it to Couchbase Server. The sync doesn't need to know about the devices. The device will just connect to sync. So it's like middleware. It's written in Go. It's deployed to a separate cluster from Couchbase Server, so it's not integrated with Couchbase Server directly. And you can use Facebook authentication, or persona, or even your own authentication to manage access to Sync Gateway. In Couchbase Server, which I've talked about a lot so far, but that's where you could hook up the other end of the Couchbase Sync tool. Okay. Couchbase Lite. Yeah, I already said it has its own little web server. The footprint is around 400K, so it's a pretty small addition to your apps. It runs in process. And yeah, so it's a NoSQL database. You have MapReduce functionality. We have some eventing and synchronization. So here's a little snippet of some Xamarin. I chose Xamarin because it's a .NET root. You can also use Teleric's native script or iOS or whatever. So I'm just saying, right here, give me a database called mgrows-database. If that doesn't exist, it'll create it. If it does exist, it'll give me a reference to it. And then I say, okay, now I have a database, create a document in the database. So I'll create a doc. And I say, okay, on that document, put some properties on there. And I'm passing in a dictionary that's going to get serialized to JSON. And there we go. That's all you have to do to save a document to Couchbase Lite on your mobile device. You can, this will automatically generate a key for you. You can also specify the key if you want to. You have a preference of how keys are created. MapReduce, it's similar to what we saw earlier with Couchbase. One of the things, though, is you can build these indexes with your native language. So if you're using Xamarin, you can build them MapReduce with C#. This is very cool because you can set breakpoints in them to debug through them, which is very nice. And the results get persisted, so we have speed up the queries with that. MapReduce is just a function in this case. So here's an example. I want to create a view called people, so I get the view. And then I say set the map. And that's going to expect a lambda that contains a document. It's going to loop through each document, pass it to this function, and an emit function that you want to call to emit the actual key value pair. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, well, if that document contains a key called Twitter, then emit that document the key value pair. If I don't have a value called Twitter, then I'm not going to emit that. So what this means is that if you don't have a Twitter account, you're not a person, which is true. But anyway, that's just a view to query, to query your documents in Couchbase Lite. And then to actually execute that, I say get the existing view of people, create that query and run it, and I can loop through the rows and display them wherever I want to do. There are asynchronous options as well, and there's also a live query option to do some stuff with observables, which we'll see in action here when I get to the demo. So you don't have to keep polling it; it'll just, look up your observable pattern. Change notification, so we can listen for changes out to the database. So we don't have to keep polling it and saying, well, is this in there yet? Is this in there yet? Is this gone yet? That sort of thing. You can just listen for a change instead. You can listen for changes in data, in queries, and even the documents. And so here's an example of that. Once we have the database, we can hook up an event to db.change. So this will happen when any change in the database occurs. This event will fire. And it looks like, your standard C# event pattern here. Database change event args has some information about the changes. So I can loop through the e.changes. It's going to be a collection, kind of get batched up, so you're not doing this one at a time here. I'll loop through those changes, and then I can see, well, what kind of change was it? Was it a conflict? Was it a delete? What is this change about? And then I can respond to that change. I can, for instance, if there's conflict, I can log the document ID, or prompt the user and say, hey, there's a conflict. What should I do about it? That sort of thing. All right. Synchronization. You get a full multi-master replication. That just means that each Couchbase Lite that's connected to the Sync Gateway is going to be a copy of the full database that gets persisted out to the mobile devices. So when you're online, it'll synchronize and get all the data that has been updated since you've been offline, and vice versa. You have some options when it comes to battery drain, because if you're polling a lot, that Sync Gateway can really drain your battery. And Sync Gateway has some ways you can handle conflict detection. So this, someone earlier mentioned conflicts. With Couchbase Mobile, it is more like you can have a split brain, right? Because each mobile device can go offline at some point, right? That's a common scenario. So we need to be able to handle that conflict. So here's how you would hook up your Couchbase Lite database to Sync Gateway. You can do a push and a pull, or you can do one or both. And you just give the address of the Sync Gateway. And this is how you can control your battery usage. You can continuously do your push and pull. It's going to use more battery than not doing it continuously. And then you just pick them up and start them. That's it. Once you do that, all you're doing now is you keep doing the same thing you were with your Couchbase Lite database. You're reading to it and writing from it. And then in the background, it's going to be syncing that to and from Sync Gateway. So the rest of your operations don't change at all. It's just once you fire off Sync Gateway, it's doing that work. All right, this slide here. Oh my goodness, look at all this. It's amazing. This is how you can get Couchbase Lite. I think these are some Java things that are good. I don't know. Someone told a joke earlier. Why do Java programmers use Java? Something like that. Why do programmers use Java?
Or glasses.
Because they can't see sharp. Or glasses. Oh, why do they wear glasses? Yeah. I messed up the joke. Anyway, new guys ready to Couchbase Lite. It's also open source on GitHub. NPM. Gateway config JSON, so it's going to start running that Sync Gateway server. Port there. Now, this next part, sometimes I see a crash. I don't know why yet. I'm going to log into Sync Gateway. You can see there's some noise happening in the background because Sync Gateway is doing something. Sometimes when I hit add list, it decides to crash. Anything doing this time? Okay, so far so good. I'm lucky. All right, so let's add a new to-do list on this app over here. Wedding planning. All right. Create the list on that side, and it syncs over to this side automatically. So then, this is the bride's phone, so she says, oh, I need to buy a dress. And then if I go over here, you can see that buy a dress shows up on my list. And the groom says, oh, I need to, I don't know, pick a venue. Which, really, there's nothing on the groom's list, right? It's all the bride's choice. Back me up, fellas, am I right? Yeah. Okay, it crashed that time. Log in, okay, and... Okay, this one's probably going to crash now, too. I'm sure it is. But you can see that it's syncing the data between them. Cake. It's going to show up over there. So all I'm doing is writing to databases locally and they get synced up to the sync gateway. Yeah, go ahead.
This isn't using sockets, right? These are actually listening to changes and doing post or actual HTTP calls individually.
The question is it using sockets or is it doing HTTP calls individually? I don't know that details.
It looked like when you get something, it shows the background HTTP post gets.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's so there's actually, if you bring up the browser, there's actually, I don't know if I want to do this or not. I'm doing off script here. It's not my area of expertise, but so the application itself, my code is not doing those posts and gets. It's the Couchbase Lite. Since I hooked up to the sync gateway, it's doing that behind the scenes. So I'm writing to the database. Since it's doing continuous, it's going to then behind the scenes go talk to the sync gateway for me. So I'm not setting up specific endpoints on sync gateway myself. That's all happening in the background.
So the client could be socket, but the server's passing on response to those listening events.
I don't know the details of whether it uses sockets or not. It very well could. I'm not sure exactly. That'd be a good thing for me to know. Was there another question? I thought someone was back there. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the server side.
Yeah.
I have been using Mongo like for 2.5 years. And,
Okay.
what I didn't hear is like, why use Couchbase versus Mongo? I mean, I saw the joins,
Yeah.
unions, and that comes to the question: does this mean there is a performance lag versus Mongo? You offer that feature in Couchbase.
So the question.
It's two questions. Like one of them is since we have joins and unsets, I would assume there is a performance trade if you offer these features for a document-based database. And why would they use Couchbase versus Mongo?
Okay, so the why would I use Couchbase versus Mongo question, that's a really broad question. I don't think I can give you an answer in a short period of time. And I'm certainly not here to say you should use one over the other. I wish you guys would try Couchbase, but ultimately it's up to you whether you want to use Mongo or Couchbase or React or whatever else you want to
There
use.
should be like a feature. It's like it should be like, I mean, XYZ feature that
Yeah.
Couchbase would better in performance, would better in something. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I don't want this to devolve in some sort of like trash talk session. There's plenty of blog posts on our site. If you're interested in seeing a deep comparison of Mongo and things like that. I just want you to try Couchbase, and if you like Mongo better, that's fine. That's totally cool. As far as performance hit with Nickel, I think compared to a standard get by document, get document by key operation, it's going to be faster to do that than it is to run Nickel query. Like I showed you earlier, that example where I'm selecting a document by ID with Nickel. I wouldn't do that instead of the standard get operation. But as far as performance goes, Nickel queries I think are as long as your indexing is sound, Nickel queries are going to be pretty fast. And additionally, writing SQL to me is more intuitive than going through a whole MapReduce thing and trying to map all these objects together. It's easier to do a join that way. It's easier to do unioning, things like that, than without using SQL.
How about bucket referencing?
Sorry?
Bucket referencing.
Bucket differencing?
Reference.
Referencing.
Yes. So can I reference like a bucket from other buckets?
Like in a Nickel query?
Yes.
Yes, you can select from multiple buckets in Nickel query. Yes.
No. I mean, assuming I had airplane, and for some reason I needed to split a document from two buckets. Like I have an airplane and I have an airport.
Uh-huh.
And for some reason they both have to be different buckets.
Yeah.
Can airport reference an object for airport reference an object for airplane and vice versa?
Yes.
And
Yes.
Does that done under the hood, or do I have to?
No. If I had two buckets here, I could just select them as if they're two different tables. So up here I could say select a.foo and b.bar from bucket 1A, and then join bucket B on keys, a dot whatever ID, that sort of thing. So I could join across buckets like that. Yes, absolutely.
Can I specify a referential constraint to Unit bucket?
Can you specify referential constraint? No, there's nothing like that built into Couchbase server itself. So that would be really on you to say, well, let me think about that. There might actually be an index, I think there might be some indexing to say, oh, it has to be unique, that sort of thing. So you can have that sort of constraint on a field. But as far as like a foreign key constraint, I don't think that would be possible with Couchbase, at least not yet. Sorry?
Database transaction. So if I have to add records, like step 1, step 2, step 3. So if my step 3 fails, can I roll back step 1 and step 2?
Transaction.
So you're talking about transactions? Yeah. Okay. So with transactions, each document write is atomic. So when you're writing to a document, that's completely atomic. Multiple documents, you can't do a transaction with Couchbase, at least not yet. That would put a lot of performance constraints on the system because you have to potentially lock different nodes, and that would be very difficult to do. So there are some patterns you can use to implement transactions, like double-check locking and things like that, but it's going to take more work for you to implement that transaction. So, yeah. If you need lots of transactions in your data, like I said, individual documents are atomic, right? So if I don't need to necessarily represent a concept in 2 different tables now, when they can live in one single document. So I don't necessarily need to worry about, did it succeed to this table and this table? Well, I've combined them into one document now, so I don't need to worry about that. But if you really do need transactional, transactions in your database, even with a NoSQL database design, there are no transactions in Couchbase. I don't think many of them do have transactions, for that matter. There are some that do, I think. I want to say like Foundation DB has transactions. It's ACID compliant, for instance. Okay. Okay, so did the mobile sample. Let's go back to my slides. Okay, and here is the Xamarin code for that app I showed you, to do light Xamarin Forms. There's other examples out there for Android, for iOS, for native script, and so on. All kinds of stuff on Couchbase Labs. These are what the stickers will look like if I remember to bring them. If you really want one, if one of these looks really cool, let me know. I'll get a mail to you. We'll figure it out. If you're really interested into a very deep dive into Couchbase, we have a Couchbase Day coming up in Schaumburg on September 22nd. It's totally free. You can sign up here. These long URLs. I have a short one here for you. CB Day Chicago, which might be easier for you to write down. It's a full day event. Free registration, workshops, presentations on Couchbase server. It's the details are there. I think it's at Hyatt, I think. Oh yeah, right there. Hyatt Place. Yeah, Hyatt Place, Chicago, Schaumburg. I don't know Chicago, so I assume you guys know what that means, or you can figure it out with Google Maps. And then, if you're interested in contacting me or the rest of my developer advocate team, you can check out our developer portal, our blog. You can ping me on Twitter. We also have a great forum, especially if you have really deep NICL questions. It's a great place to ask. Stack Overflow, we also monitor that as well. That's all I got. So I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm going to stick around as long as it takes to answer you guys' questions. And other than that, guys have a good evening.
All right, thanks, Matt. Now it's time for it's time for the raffle. If you guys, is anyone not signed in that wants to be included? If you haven't.